In this video, we will be introducing the basics of the standard 3D engines that ship with After Effects. A 3D engine is a rendering mechanism by which the program renders 3D layers into final images. By default, the program ships with what we call the basic or classic 3D engine. Now that is when you create any layer, when you create in any composition, you turn any layer into 3D, the program tags that composition to be rendered through the basic 3D renderer. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a fairly straightforward setup. This right here is a white solid that is about 200 pixels in width and height, and I have a spotlight right in front of it. Now I have applied to the white solid, I have applied keyframes to the position and rotation values so that it moves across the screen and it rotates as it does so. So take a look at this. Basically, you see that the layer behaves like a 3D layer. It's rotating in its y-axis. So that is the basic 3D, classic 3D rendering engine. Now, this renders really well and it renders fast, but it has drawbacks. The drawbacks in this is that, as you can see, this layer at some point it's invisible. Basically, it is a 2.5D layer. It's not really a 3D layer, even though it moves in 3D. It lacks extrusion, it lacks volume. So in order to be able to render things with volume in After Effects, we need to use the Cinema 4D engine. The Cinema 4D engine was introduced into the program with the 2017 version of the program, so about 4 or 5 versions ago. And the thing is that that engine replaced another engine called the Ray Tracing engine, which had a lot of advantages. It was a really powerful engine, but it rendered really slow in After Effects. So Adobe made the decision to drop that engine in favor of the Cinema 4D. Also because at the time, Maxon and Adobe partnered up to create a version of Cinema 4D inside After Effects called Cinema 4D Lite. And as you will see when we talk in the Cinema 4D video, you actually have full access to that program inside After Effects. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at what this engine does for us. If I turn a layer into a 3D layer and I'm working with the classic 3D renderer, if I uncollapse the layer, you will notice that the layer not only has the transformation values that we had in the past, but it also has geometry options that have been grayed out, and those are available to you only when you're using the Cinema 4D renderer. And it also has material options that allow you to control the type of material that this is made of, where we also, in that dropdown, we also find where the light interactions with the material or with the object actually are controlled from here, from these settings. So we have a few things that we can change, such as the shininess and the specular, meaning the highlights in the object, and the metalness of the object. Those are the things that we can change with the classic 3D renderer. So it doesn't have a lot of options, but it renders fairly fast. So for a 2.5D title sequence or something that you're just flipping on 2D space and on 2.5D space, then this works really well. However, sometimes we do want to introduce extrusion. We want to introduce volume into our layers. And to do so, we use the Cinema 4D renderer. To switch the renderer from 3D to from classic 3D to Cinema 4D renderer, we either choose by clicking this button here. If you click it, it opens up the compositions window under the third tab. You can also go under that layer that you want for which you are required to change the entirety of the entire renderer for the entire composition. You can click on that link that says change renderer and it will open up the exact same window. Or you can simply open up your composition settings and go to the third tab. All 3 links take you to the exact same spot. And from here, you would choose what properties, which one of the 2 engines you want to work with, Classic 3D or Cinema 4D. Now, when I choose Cinema 4D, I deactivate certain things that come with the Classic 3D, but I activate new ones that are available within the Cinema 4D. So this list tells you what has been enabled and what has been disabled. You enable extrusion, reflections, curvature on layers, material overrides. You also have the ability to recognize environment layers, which is great because that allows you to create almost like an orb or a sphere around in the universe of After Effects that can be used as reflections or as lighting in a scene. It's pretty much like a an actual, I forget the name of the light in a 3D program, where you have a NOR light that basically can create ambient light and use an image as the light generating point. Now, the thing though is that you lose a lot of good things when you switch to this engine. Blending modes, which we know for multiply, add, overlay, all those things that we know of, basically they won't render under this engine. Nor will track mattes, which is a drawback, a significant drawback, nor layers that you bring in from Photoshop into your layers, or the ones that you add within After Effects layer styles that you add to layers, they will not be recognized. Neither will be masks. So there's a lot of things that are dropped off. Mainly for me, the things that hurt the most when rendering are motion blur and camera depth of field. These two things, basically, I lose the ability to control those from the actual composition and from the actual layers and from the camera. And so I find myself having to find workarounds in order to compensate for that. But when I choose Cinema 4D, there are reasons for it. Either I am using extrusions within my objects, or I am bringing in files that I need to render through the Cinema 4D engine, namely 3D objects that can be brought in from Cinema 4D directly into a composition window in After Effects. So when you bring those in, you want to make use of this engine in order to take advantage of the full array of rendering options that come from that program. So let me go ahead and cancel this. Let me show you what that rendering, switching the rendering to Cinema 4D allowed me to do. If I scrub through this, you will notice that this is basically the same composition as this, but the solid that I have, instead of using a solid, in this case I used a shape layer, and in the shape layer I created a hole by creating a merge merge paths component inside that actual shape. So I have a rectangle, which is the outside. I have an ellipse, which is the center area. And then I have a merge paths that allows me to create that operation between those two shapes. If you don't remember how to do this, I suggest you go back and look at the video for repeaters. That's where I explain how to use this merge paths option. Now, in short, basically the merge paths creates a Boolean operation between these two shapes, where I can choose from the merge paths what the operation will be. A Boolean operation in this program is the same as a Boolean operation in a 3D program, or a pathfinding operation in Illustrator, where you have the ability to use the way two shapes intersect with each other to determine what the geometry result is from those two shapes crisscrossing one another. So in this case, I have chosen to subtract the ellipse, which is the one below, from the rectangle, which is the one on the top. Now, if I switch these two things around, then I get a nothing, because the rectangle is a lot bigger than the ellipse. Therefore, when I say subtract the rectangle from the ellipse, there's not enough ellipse to see the rectangle. So the order in which the geometry is set up under the group here in the shape layer matters. And in this case, the ellipse, being the smaller and being inside, basically has been subtracted from the rectangle through the merge paths component, which I added from in here, from the drop-down menu. There it is. So with that done, after I've done this, let me actually go ahead and move down onto the geometry options. Now you'll notice that the geometry options have been activated for that layer, because I am now in the Cinema 4D environment. And under that geometry options, I have the option to create extrusion. So extrusion is what gives volume to shapes. So in this case, let me make it 50 so you can see this in a little bit more detail. So you notice that this is a lot more, it has a lot more volume. And I can also add things such as beveling to this. So let me switch from the bevel style from none to angular. And you notice that there's a bit of a change, but we don't notice much of anything. We just see a little trim. Now let me exaggerate this to about 30. So you guys actually can see what this does. And you'll notice that I have basically created a bevel around that box. Now I can switch it from angular to concave, which is where we shave off some, it looks like we're shaving off pieces of the edge, or convex to give it a rounded feel. So you see the control that you have over the way the geometry is rendered in the composition. It's great. I mean, and it renders fairly fast. You know, it doesn't take a lot of rendering power to render things like this. So this is true 3D in this case versus the 2.5D that we've been working with. This is actually true 3D, and it was created out of a shape. So things that you can render as 3D objects inside After Effects. You can render text as 3D, you can render shapes as 3D, and you can render Cinema 4D files that you bring in from Cinema 4D into After Effects as 3D objects. It will recognize them as 3D objects and allow you to render them that way. There's also an array of plugins that you can actually add to the program. One called Element 3D. It's basically a mini program that is attached to After Effects, and it allows you to control 3D, to see 3D objects as 3D objects with the After Effects cameras. But it requires that third-party plugin. I use it all the time. It's worth the investment if you're actually working on 3D renders a lot in After Effects. I suggest that you look into it. It's called Element 3D by a company called Video Copilot. So besides these options of having the bevel and the geometry extrusion and all that other stuff, let's take a look at what happens under material options. Under material options, we now have a lot more options, a lot more properties to work with the quality of the render. So these, we see the standard ones that are the way the light interacts with our object, the ones up here, but we also have things called reflections. So we actually have the ability to have reflectivity on the material of the object. We have the ability to control the way the light of the ambience of the entire scene affects the object. The diffuse is the amount of color that we see based on the color of the shape that we're working with. The specular intensity is the amount of highlights that you get. Specular shininess refers as to how polished that object looks. The metalness introduces the concept of making something dull or making it very basically plasticky or metally. And then reflection intensity changes the amount of intensity from anything else on the scene that might be interacting visually with that particular material. So you have the ability to control quite a lot of things with the Cinema 4D. They actually bring in a lot more control over the materials. If you have worked with a 3D program such as Blender or 3ds Max or Maya, all of these things will make sense to you. And you have the ability to control them here as you do in Maya or in those programs in the 3D environment. So that is what the advantage of activating the Cinema 4D does for you. That's one of the advantages that it gives you. But you drop a lot of other things such as the modes and all those things. So that's the drawback. Now, if I pre-compose these things and bring both of them, both the 2D and the 3D, classic 3D, sorry, and the Cinema 4D into a regular standard composition, it will respect the rendering from both of them. So you actually see them both rendering with that because none of these layers is a 3D layer. I have no rendering engine on this. So the program recognizes that it has to use both rendering engines in order to render. But in this case, in order to see one in front of the other, we need to use the stacking order. So it's not that they're not really being recognized as 3D layers, as you can see. They look like 3D, but you see the interaction. In the interaction, the classic 3D remains always behind the other one because it is behind on the stacking order. So it's something to keep in mind. But it will respect both of them when it goes to render. So if they don't interact, they don't crisscross each other, then you can take advantage of this for your compositions. Now, we just talked about shape extrusions, but I wanted to show you more in detail what these things do. I showed you the shape that I use for this renderer here. But in this case, I wanted to show you something that works really well. Notice that, let me switch my view from active camera to front view, and you'll notice that this is basically a set of paths. As a matter of fact, it's not a set of paths only, it's only one path. So let me go to the content for that particular layer. Let me go to the trim path layer. You'll notice that this is a group and there's only one path, which is the Polystar path. That's all it is. And that Polystar path has basically just the Polystar and the controllers for it. And inside it, we have basically just a path. That's all it is. So how do I know that that's just a path? Let me go ahead and turn off the repeater object here. Let me go ahead and the component. Let's turn it off and you'll see that this is just a path on the screen. And as I scrub, basically I see the path has been trimmed through a trim paths component right here. So I have and I have changed that in and out points, the start and ending points for that path. And then I'm simply keyframing the offset to make the path move or to make that trim move around the path. So that is the geometry in this thing. It's fairly straightforward, nothing magical about this. We've done this in the past. Now let me go ahead and collapse that trim paths again. And let's go ahead and activate the repeater. Now what the repeater does is it creates versions of it that are repeating and they're offset from one another inward because they have been scaled in. And now when I switch my view to my active camera, I have extruded that path under the extrusion settings for the geometry settings to a value of 100. And you can see that basically I have created a fairly complex animation with just one path and a trim in that path, and then extruding it and rendering it with the Cinema 4D engine. And I can animate the my camera around this if I need to. So for example, let me stop this here really quick. So you can see if I go ahead and switch my orbiting tool, I could easily just create an animation of the camera moving around it like this or so. So you can imagine creating a 3D logo in a fairly fast way this way, because it gives you that amount of flexibility. You can actually create really complex shapes in a very short amount of time. Along with the Cinema 4D, all of the material options are in here still, so you actually have access to all that stuff. And so it becomes, it gives you quite a lot for a lot of flexibility to work with. So with that, along with this, let's take a look at this in detail. Let me go ahead and zoom into 100%. And you'll notice that I get a little bit of staircasing around the edges. If you notice this around here, you see a little bit of aliasing. And the reason for that is because by default, the program will be working on draft mode when you're working with this in order to save rendering time. It'll start downgrading the quality. So even if I switch my rendering to final quality, to high quality, you still see the aliasing. But just turning it on here, it says to me, okay, well, that didn't work. So what do I do now? Well, you'll notice that under right next to the Cinema 4D button up in the top of the composition, I have a little gear button. If I click on that, you'll notice that basically this is all dealing with the actual rendering engine. And by default, the quality on this is draft. That is the default for this. If I want to up my quality, I can increase this to, let's say, 4. And you'll notice that I do away with the aliasing. So it's smooth now. But my rendering time will be slightly affected because I am increasing the quality, and it's problematic, but it looks really nice. It looks really, so it is worth waiting. And I wouldn't do this upping up the quality until I am ready to render my final file. So I would always go back. I would do one quick test to see what it does. If I like it, then that's fine. Go back to one, click OK. So that you remember when we send something to render, we always need to up the quality of all the files, of all the layers, activate all the switches and so on. This is one of the things to remember to go back and revisit to increase the quality in order to better render your 3D environments. Now, let's talk about curvature. And so for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new composition. I'm going to go ahead and create a new composition. And this composition I'm going to call curve final. All right, and in this composition, I am going to drop I'm going to create a new, actually, I'm just going to do it with the rectangle tool. So I'm just going to simply draw a rectangle on the screen. Let me actually fit this to screen really quick, fit to 100%. And so I have that rectangle, and I am going to choose a fill color for it. Let's go ahead and choose, let's choose red. Let's keep it as red for now. Okay, so we'll click OK on that. And in this rectangle, in this shape layer, what we want to do for this shape layer, let me go ahead and switch. I want to switch it to a 3D layer. So I want to make it a 3D layer. And in this Cinema 4D environment, now I have the ability, actually, let me see. I don't see why this is not showing me the fill color, which is odd. It should see a fill color in here. Let me turn it on. There you go. That's why. So I'll turn it on. And when I turn that into a 3D layer, and let me bring in a camera into this environment, to node camera is fine. Let me orbit this camera a little bit so I can see what is going on. And let me maybe pull that camera out a little bit. So actually I get a better sense for what's going to happen here. With that shape layer selected, if I want to activate curvature for that layer, I need to pre-compose that layer. And the reason for that is because right here, when I go to the geometry options, it respects the fact that this is an actual shape. So it will give me the options for geometry for a shape. So now if I pre-compose that layer, let me select it and pre-compose it. And I am going to simply call it a curved shape. And I'm going to move all attributes into it because that's the only option I have open available to me. I'll click OK on that. And you'll notice that it goes back to being flat, right? Even though my camera hasn't moved. When I turn it into a 3D layer, because it was pre-composed from a shape layer, it will recognize the camera. This only happens with shape layers. So if you want the shape layer to be recognized as a 3D layer again and maintain its the way it was before, you need to turn it into a shape layer. Now, into a 3D layer. Once you do that, if you uncollapse this under geometry options, it no longer sees that it is a 3D a shape layer. It sees it as a regular 3D layer, as if it was an image, for example. And so you see that your geometry options have changed from extrusion to other things. In this case, you have curvature and segments. Segments is the amount of subdivisions into which this will be subdivided to be recognized as a flat image. And the curvature is the amount of curving that you want. So let's increase that number of segments to, let's say, something like 64, for example. And then I'm going to make a curvature value of 100%. You'll notice that my layer has been curved. And if let me call my camera orbiting tool. If I orbit around it, I'll see that it's basically a 3D curvature. Let me add a light in here. Let me actually double click the shape, the shape over here and add a light. And so I'm gonna just add a spotlight with the value that it has. There it is. Let's go back to the curved final and you'll see that the spotlight is recognized in here. So it actually gives me that curvature value, and 100% in this case curvature basically creates half of a cylinder. That's basically what it does. It creates half of a circle. So you have the ability to combine different options. So in this case, for example, I have these paths that have been trimmed moving across the screen, and then I have put them all into this composition here, and I have curved one in one direction and the other layered, one in one direction, the other one in the opposite direction, and it creates the sensation of a cylinder in space. And this is literally just by adding curvature to the geometry options in here, as you can see. So that is how you control curvature for paths. To create curvature for text setups, we're going to talk about that when we talk about 3D text. Now, one final thing to talk about in this introduction to the engines is collapse transformations. That is this switch on this side. The collapse transformations is this switch that is available to you every time you set up a composition to have 3D layers. So what does that mean? Well, let me replicate what I created here really quick. I'm just going to create a new, let me close this one. And I'm going to create a new composition, and I'm going to call it box comp. Now, inside that box comp, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a shape layer. And in that shape layer, I am going to add a rectangle, which by default is 100 by 100, if you remember. And I'm going to add also a fill for that, and I'm going to leave it as red for now. So I'm going to group those two things, Control G or Command G on the PC, Command G on the Mac. And with that group one, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and collapse it. That's all I want for now. Now I'm going to make 6 copies of this guy, of this shape layer. So I'm going to make 5 more copies. So Control E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 6 layers altogether. Now, with the layers selected, I am going to go to this search engine here, and this search engine allows me to look for things that are that have been named specific things within the layers down here. In this case, I want to look for the color option for those fills. So if I go and start typing color, you'll notice that it opens up the color options for all the layers that are within my composition. So I can go ahead and get started by changing color. So I'm going to keep the top one red. I'm going to switch this one to this nice yellow here. And I am going to get to the next one, and that's going to be green. And I'm going to scroll down to the next one, and that's going to be the aqua color. The next one's going to be the dark blue. And the final one is going to be the fuchsia, this one here. So I have changed the colors of all the fills on all the solid, on all these shapes. If I want to see what they look like, let me turn off the visibility of them. Since they're all one on top of one another, then that's why I only see the topmost, which is the red one here. Now, with that in mind, let's remember, I made these default size. So remember the default size for any shapes, any rectangular shapes in a composition, it's 100. So if I keep that number in mind, I know that I can offset each one of these 50 pixels either back, forward, left, right, up, or down, and then I can create a box where each one of those shapes becomes a side. So let's say, for example, let's start with this one. I'm going to place that one. I'm going to call this position value. Let me turn everything into 3D layers first and foremost. Let's do that. So I want to push that first shape 50 pixels into the distance on the z-axis. So 50, and it moves back. Now let me go ahead and go to the next one. Let's open up the position values for everything actually. So 50 for the top one, -50 to bring this one forward. This one will be 50 on to the right hand side. So if I make that 50 to the right hand side, that would be 360 plus 50, that would be 410. And that would move it down on the y-axis. Then the next one would be -360 minus 50, boom, 310. So that moved that one to the top. And then this one will be moving on the x-axis, 640 plus 50, 690. And then this one would be 640 minus 50, 590. There you go. So now I have all these 3 layers displaced in 3D space. Let's go ahead and create a new camera so you guys can see what this looks like. And let me orbit so you guys can get an idea of what I did. I basically displaced all of the different rectangles, all the different shapes. Now what I want to do is I want to rotate them all to fall into place. So I'm going to call their rotation value. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the side ones. So the top ones, the first one stays as is, which is this one here in the back. This one in the front also stays as is, so I don't care about the rotation for that one. This one needs to be reoriented or rotated on this is, let's bring this back in here to see what the orientation is. This is the one on the top. This one is the top, the bottom. So that needs to be rotated on the x-axis. So if I make that 90 degrees, basically I rotated that to fit the bottom of the box, as you can see. Let's do that same thing with the blue one. 90 degrees on the blue one, rotates it, and it becomes the cap at the top. Now I'm going to do it with the dark blue one, which is this one here, but this one needs to be rotated on the y-axis. So I'll go, well, not this one, sorry, the next one. So I'll do 90 degrees on the y-axis for that one, and let me rotate around. And I'm going to rotate 90 degrees on the y-axis for the fuchsia one. So now I literally have created a cube in 3D space with those boxes. I have a cube. Okay. Now I want to be able to control this cube with one single layer because they're all independent layers. We saw this when we were parenting layers in a previous video. So I'm going to create a null object, and this null object will be called controller. And I have now the ability to set all of these layers to be children of that controller. And let me turn that controller into 3D. Now with that controller set up, I can go ahead and control the rotation of that object with one single layer. So this is one of the advantages that you have for creating something like this. So that's basically what I had set up over here. Basically, it's the exact same setup. Now where this gets interesting is when I want to make use of that box into another layer. So into another composition. So if I go ahead and create a new composition here, let's say, and I'm going to call this final collapse transformations. I can go ahead and bring in that pre-composed box comp into this. So let's look for box comp. There it is. I'm going to drop it in here, and you'll notice that it is recognized as I left it in the other composition, right? But when I bring in a camera into this environment, basically I have the ability to manipulate that camera in this layer, but you'll notice that nothing is rotating in this layer. And that is because even though it does recognize what you left it as from the previous composition, whereas over here the camera allows me to rotate around, on this composition, you'll notice that no rotation is happening. I'm not orbiting. I'm not able to create bring that ability into this layer. To do that, you use the same switch that we use for continuously rasterized layers in compositions for vector files. So that is, click that on, and you'll notice now that the layer, the collapse transformations, will recognize this camera as the new camera for your 3D environment. And even though you only have this 3D, this as a flattened 2D layer in this composition, it recognizes whatever is inside it as 3D. And it allows this camera to interact with the 3D values of that layer. You'll notice now that even though it is a 2D layer, let me place this as up front as possible. You'll notice that even though this is a 2D layer, let me switch my camera tool to the pan tool. And you'll notice that as I move that 2D layer, I actually see the 3D value of the content of that composition, of that pre-composition. So continuously rasterizing allows you to take advantage of using a camera outside of the composition to recognize the 3D elements of a flat 2D composition into a separate composition and still respect those values. And it respects not only orbiting and panning, but it also respects the ability to zoom in or out into it, to truck in or out into if you want to dolly around in your composition. It allows you to do that seamlessly and respects that 3D value. So this is a short introduction to the engines, 3D engines in After Effects. In the next videos, we're going to talk a little bit more about actually making use of these 3D engines by creating 3D text and manipulating 3D geometry to actually take advantage of a lot of the advantages that the different engines have, plus the ability to bring in Cinema 4D files or 3D files from other programs into After Effects.